The event-based stuff is a bit trickier. And here, I would say that often the right thing to do is to not use an orchestration tool, because if you've got an event-driven architecture, then that's not what you use an orchestration tool for. If you're having a conversation with a chatbot, you're sending messages, you're sending events, you're getting a response back. That, I would argue, should be dealt with by microservices. But something interesting that we do, because we have integrations to these underlying pieces of cloud infrastructure, is monitor them. So if you had your LLM hosted on a box somewhere, then we would be able to monitor that. And something else which is quite unique about Orchestra is that we put data products first. So you can say, okay, this is the cost of the data pipeline to serve my product. Something else you can do by monitoring the box that's hosting your LLM is also work out the usage of it. So then Orchestra is sort of doing some orchestration in this case, but the main value is giving you an update on the health of your product. Maybe your LLM is hosted on the EC2 box, but then it's going really well and you're hitting capacity. How do you know what the status is of that product? Right? How do you know the cost of that EC2 box? How do you know how many requests are going through it? This is all information which is helpful from the product angle that we can also access. And that it sort of goes back to how we built a platform, which is to be able to monitor and gather data in addition to sort of triggering and monitoring workflows.
Hey buddy, welcome back to another episode of How AI is Built. Today, we have a very special guest. Hugo Lu is the founder and CEO of Orchestra. Orchestra is a serverless data orchestration tool that aims to provide a unified control plane for managing data pipelines, infrastructure, and analytics. Learn how to build pipelines as code that can scale infinitely.
At Joule, they had a guy who was quite a lot younger than me, getting paid a lot more to manage something called Kubernetes and Airflow. I didn't really understand why. And obviously, as I learned more and more about data engineering, sort of got to understand that a bit more. And I guess the thing that surprised me was that obviously, with all of that capital outlay and investment, you had an orchestration tool that works really well. But there's lots of stuff you don't have that you still have to build yourself, like plugins, alerting, like visibility, UI. And it just meant that the whole process of getting like an end-to-end data pipeline, and now I guess AI pipeline, took a really, really long time. And then you sort of combine that with a whole plethora of other modern data stack vendors. Well, maybe I shouldn't say modern data stack vendors, but let's just say a whole host of other tools that are supposedly necessary. It all kind of made sense for me to live in one place. So that's kind of what Orchestra is. It's sort of like the unified control plane for your data stack. It's the glue that stitches together all your cloud infrastructure, but it's also your data platform team. It's all of the boilerplate stuff that every single data platform team builds in a single platform.
And in its evolution, like what development are you actually most proud of?
I think probably the underlying architecture I quite like. There are two components to this which are cool. So the first is all of the orchestration is serverless. So it scales really well. And because it's serverless, it's kind of as cheap as it gets. This is obviously in stark contrast to something like Airflow, where you kind of need a pretty chunky cluster and you normally have to pay someone to manage it or pay for a managed service like Cloud Composer or MWAA. That's a lot of complexity that I didn't think was necessary for basic orchestration. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just how versatile the architecture is. So with what we've built, we can trigger anything, we can monitor anything, we can get any data, we have a really nice UI, and that's actually quite a lot to do. So yeah, I think a combination of orchestration combined with metadata and like actual actionable analytics is what I'm most proud of.
Yeah, and I love serverless. Just anything serverless. It's just near and dear to my heart. I think like most companies are doing like so much undifferentiated heavy lifting by going with something like Airflow, where they have to orchestrate like so many different infrastructure components, which most of the time isn't really necessary. And if we are looking at the architecture, if you would have to explain to someone how Orchestrator works under the hood, how would you go about that?
It really is as simple as serverless, right? It's like we have a UI, which people use for building pipelines, but we get that engineers, as they should, want things to be version controlled and controllable in code because this is reliable, but it also scales better, right? If you imagine you have to build 1,000 pipelines, you're not going to want to do that in the UI. So what happens when you build the UI is you do actually just generate code, you just generate files. And then with these files, we run them. So that's sort of the pipeline builder component, right? That's the sort of dev workflow component. In terms of the actual underlying orchestration, it's very similar to something like Airflow. It's just like you have lots and lots of tasks that do things like trigger tasks, monitor tasks. We have endpoints where you can listen to things like webhooks, so that if you need to complete a task without us being able to pull it, basically, you can do that via webhook too. And then, of course, we've got tasks that go ahead and fetch additional metadata and clean metadata. So a really common example, I mean, have you used dbt a lot?
Yeah.
Yeah. So something pretty much every single data team I know does is they have a task that saves their artifacts somewhere, their dbt artifacts. Then they have another task that loads those into some kind of analytical database. And then they have another task that cleans those artifacts, that flattens them, so you can just see your test results over time. And then it's like, oh, wow, now I have a data quality data set. And all of this is kind of boilerplate. It's like every time you build that in Airflow, you've got to write 6 different tasks. So in Orchestra, it's just like for the user, it's just one. We just kind of do lots of that under the hood. And yeah, they're basically the 2 main components.
And where do you actually see at your customers? Where is the point, or what are the problems they encounter where they actually go from like not needing an orchestration tool to needing an orchestration tool?
I think it's definitely scale, but I think increasingly people want something like this from the get-go. So the traditional answer to this question is when you have lots of people using your data products, when you have lots of pipelines that you've got, lots of dashboards, the cost and the pain that the data person feels when something breaks is pretty high. And every single person that's worked in data knows the pain, like a head of sales or like a CEO messaging them on Slack being like, this data doesn't look right. That's just like so painful. And often the reason for that is because data teams don't do orchestration, or the manner in which they do data orchestration isn't as robust as it could be, which means that part of a pipeline fails, like the dashboard refresh happens, maybe there's missing data, maybe there's no data, maybe there's something weird in the data, but data teams are kind of like the last to know. So it's normally when they hit the scale, they start having these experiences that they think, okay, now I need not necessarily just an orchestration tool, but also like a unified system of governance and control for everything. I think increasingly because people want to build data pipelines that are actually surfacing AI apps, right? And like you'll have this as well yourself, right? When you're doing AI implementations for companies, you're not just building the AI application. I doubt it's ever the case that they have that perfect production grade data set that's just ready to go for the chatbot, right? It's like you're also building the end to end. And that's a big investment at the end. It's like if people have a big model that they know is going to cost thousands of dollars, you can't afford for the pipeline behind it to just be like on a schedule, unmonitored, no data quality checks. Because you're going to do your V1, it's going to work for a week. You're going to pat yourself on the back, and then it's going to break. So, yeah.
And if you're looking at a data orchestration problem that you want to solve with Orchestra, what are like the different components that you always look at and that you see and that you then have to pull together to actually solve it?
Ooh, what do you mean?
So basically, what are the different components of data orchestration and how do they actually work together? So basically like source, destination, and the actual script.
I mean, I think normally, and maybe this gets to how people use orchestration tools, it centers around stitching bits of infrastructure up together. So if you come to me and you say, hey, Hugo, I'm really struggling to get data from this API and then clean it, I'm not going to help you with that. I'm going to say, okay, well, you can write a script yourself and put it on a computer, right? You can buy an out-of-the-box connector if that works for you and you can afford it. But for me, I'm really just stitching together different pieces of infrastructure. So I guess normally the first thing we have to solve is do we have like a managed integration for the thing you're trying to do? It's like if I've not built the plugin for you, you can't trigger it. But equally with the plugins that we have built, you can do most things. So a really good example of that is Snowflake, right? It's like from my perspective, dealing with the Snowflake API is very straightforward because you can pretty much do anything with a query. So the main components always revolve around how can we make the architecture as efficient and as modular as possible So imagine the different components that do their job really well. Microservice that moves data from S3 to some other location, some kind of service that's able to efficiently manipulate data in a data warehouse environment, right? That is Snowflake, that is BigQuery. And then when it comes to the orchestration, there's almost very little left to do. It's just stitching things up together and ensuring the monitoring comes in. I think the monitoring is also a really big part of it, because often people want to know exactly what happened. And with a tool like Airflow, if you trigger something that has DAG capability underneath, in Airflow, you get one box and one status code and one duration, when in fact it could be tens or hundreds of different things that are going on. Orchestra will show that metadata to you and alert you on it, so you know exactly what actually failed. Not just like Nicolay's big daily job failed in Snowflake. It's no, it was this table, it took this time, there were this many rows. They're the main components.
And if you're looking at different organization, what do different maturity levels of data orchestration mean?
What do they mean?
Yeah, basically, how do different organizations look like that are beginning in data orchestration and then the real pros of data orchestrations?
There are so many flavors of this, right? I think at the immature level, you typically will have people running various jobs on different schedules. So data loading at midnight, data cleaning at 1 o'clock, refresh dashboards at 3 o'clock, send alerts, automate workflows at 4 o'clock, something like that. And then people will try to stitch things together using tools. So triggering one tool from another tool using a webhook. That obviously only works for linear flows, or if you have two things that need to happen first before the next thing happens. You can't do that via webhook, but that's normally the next thing people do. And then up until now, right, you have people using things like Airflow. And then after Airflow, you have people forking it and writing a hell of a lot of custom code. So for example, I was at a Databricks event in London the other day, and Kraken was speaking. So for anyone listening, Kraken's the technology arm of Octopus, which is an energy company in the UK. Kraken create technology for other energy providers. And they have a lot of people working on that whole unified control plane. They've got their own logging frameworks. They've got lots of custom plugins. They've got loads of custom stuff that they've written in Airflow. They've got people managing that cluster full time. They've got people building out their own custom data quality frameworks. I think that's great. This is fantastic. It's exactly the same thing that we do. We're all data engineers. We all do exactly the same thing. It is something which you see that's repeated a lot across enterprises which are that big. It's typically taking something like Airflow and then customizing it a lot.
Yeah. What are the most interesting or also weird cases where you have seen Orchestra being used?
The weird cases? I wouldn't say they're weird, but it's definitely outside of the analytical realm, right? So I would describe myself as technical, but I don't come from a software engineering background. The reason I got into data was to do analytics for the business. And I think often people forget that orchestration tools have other applications. For example, something which we've used a bit at Orchestra, sort of trigger and monitor batch workflows, is AWS Step. And we've seen Orchestra used for use cases like that as well, when people are actually building their own products, their software products. So a very common pattern we've seen is someone has an application, you sign up for it, and then through that sign-up flow, what results is some sort of basic user data landing somewhere like S3. And then they'll have a Lambda listening to S3 that says, hey, Nicolay just signed up to this, sends a webhook to Orchestra, and then Orchestra will then trigger the data processing for you. So that then when you go into the application you just signed up for, you actually see some stuff. That's something which is pretty cool. Another thing we've seen people do is leverage Orchestra to sort of facilitate a migration. So because we have integrations to lots of different tools, it means that if you're migrating from one to another, but you still want to retain visibility across everything you're doing without losing that for your migration, which could take months, right? You don't want to have to do a migration without any visibility. You can still use Orchestra for that. But yeah, I wouldn't say they're weird. They're just a bit more off-piste.
And these are the interesting use cases to me. And I think if you're looking at Airflow, one of the key pieces of Airflow, which is actually lacking for me, is actually the visibilities in singular tables, for example, that are changing, where Dexter picks up where it's really differentiates. How do you think, like, what sets Orchestra apart, and how do you actually differentiate from the different tools, like especially the more modern one like Mage, Prefect, and Dexter?
I think, like, at their heart, any of those open source workflow orchestration tools are very similar in the sense that if you want to get the benefit of them, everything your organization runs has to run through them. It's like the minute you start using some other tool to do something, even if it's Snowflake, right? Even if it's triggering some tasks in Snowflake, those tools don't know what happens because they can't fetch data. So Snowflake has an orchestrator. Databricks has an orchestrator. It's called Databricks Workflows. It's like you can have a DAG there. If you have another layer on top, you lose the DAG because that tool triggers things. It doesn't fetch data. It doesn't surface metadata as well. So that's one thing Orchestra does. But the other thing relates to having a modular architecture. It's like, what do you do if you're an enterprise with multiple teams that have multiple repos? What do you do if you're an enterprise that have multiple teams that maybe have one repo for like your orchestration and your code, but then another team just uses dbt Cloud in the IDE and they just run everything from there? Like, how do you get end-to-end visibility from all of that? Like, you can't. It's like inevitably in data teams with the larger scale, you have this sort of modular scattered architecture. And this also gets to data mesh, right, which is very popular, which is one of the core tenets of that is different teams should be able to use the tools they want, but you should still have some shared infrastructure. Orchestra is that shared infrastructure. So if you want to do everything in Orchestra, you can, but it also means that if you have a very modular stack across different teams, across different tools, you can still retain this end-to-end control, but also like end-to-end lineage, end-to-end understanding of exactly what's going on. And I think that's pretty unique, right? To their credit, I think Dagster have actually announced that they're doing this recently, but it's very new and it's also only available if you're running cloud. So you still have to pay for it there as well. Nothing's free.
Maybe looking a little bit on the use case side, where would you say, like, what are the use cases where Orchestra might actually be the wrong choice, where you're better with something else?
So because we all run on serverless in cloud infrastructure, we can deploy on your cloud infrastructure if we absolutely have to. But if you need something with, basically, if you need to self-host something yourself, or you need to put something on some kind of hardware, we're not the right choice because we're cloud SaaS.
And to the developers who are mostly worry when they actually can code something, what's like your sales pitch to the developer to convince them that using more in the direction of like infrastructure as code, like the configuration files, that this is a viable option?
Well, with Orchestra, you still get IAC. So all of our stuff is version control. We haven't exposed the Git integration to people yet, but we will. So that's not an issue. I think it just all comes down to what kind of developer experience you want and how much where you want to spend your money. I think having an enormous repository of code that's responsible for data ingestion, data movement, Spark, data cleaning, DBT, operational stuff like sending alerts and refreshing dashboards, that is a really, really, really hard thing to do effective continuous integration of. So imagine you've got a process that loads data from source to S3, and then you have a Snowflake task that loads it into Snowflake, and then you have a DBT model that cleans it, and then you have a dashboard refresh. Like, are you going to do CI on all of that when you change your schema in your data ingestion code? Good luck. And, the good thing about having a modular architecture, right, is like you can still keep everything you do in code. It's just more spread out, right? So you have your repository for ingestion, your DBT repo, and that has other advantages, right? Like principle of least privilege, access. It just means that the orchestration side is separate. So I would say Orchestra very much like its best practices in mind from the start, because this was a problem I've also had. And people should definitely keep a lot of their dev workflows that they've already got, because a lot of them are very good. Like, for example, the DBT dev workflow is excellent. That's why it's so popular. I would never try to build something that would take that away, because it would be a step backwards. It's just around understanding what that dev workflow should look like. I think it should be a bit more modular, whereas other orchestration tools would say, make it more complicated, put it all in one place. And I don't think that's necessarily always the best thing. And often it's just not feasible with the example I just gave.
Yeah. And when I'm looking at data orchestration because we often have AI workloads. And at the moment with generative AI, I think more and more of the AI workloads are moving into the data collection and ingestion parts, where you actually compute chunks, where you compute embeddings, where you do like tagging classifications. What are like the special things to consider in data orchestration for AI?
Well, I guess, so question for you. What is an example of a very simple AI pipeline for you? What tools are you using? What are they doing?
So what I often go back to is actually separate buckets, and I trigger it, for example, in Google via an event arc. I trigger serverless function, which in the end calls my AI endpoint, like my classification or my embedding model.
Got it. And then is the embedding model self-hosted, or is that OpenAI or?
So it can be anything. Most often, because we are in the EU, we are self-hosting, but for US-based clients, it might be as well in the EU. In OpenAI.
And is the pipeline so you've described a sort of like event-based pipeline, sort of like what you'd see beneath a chatbot, where someone presses a button, send a message, and then that message gets populated through. Is there any sort of batch process that is done in order to move data that's trained, like that's used to train a model, or like is made available for RAG, something like that?
So most often you have like two different things. You have like in the beginning, you have one batch workload where you actually take the existing data and move it into whatever format and whatever database you actually have. Then you have usually you have some data which is coming in, which on occasion has to be really fast. So it has to be streamed into the database because it has to be available in real time. Or which are the majority cases, it isn't as important, where you actually can have some latency.
Yeah, nice. So I think in terms of how Orchestra would work with that, the batch workflow is pretty easy. That's kind of what we do anyway. We orchestrate systems that help you move data, help you clean data, and help you train models. So something we're building at the moment, for example, is like SageMaker integration. So if you have a pre-configured job, which is going to sort of train a model, we can do that. If you've got some kind of RAG thing set up in Cortex, if you need to sort of interact with Snowflake from Orchestra, you can do that too. The event-based stuff is a bit trickier. And here, I would say that often the right thing to do is to not use an orchestration tool, because if you've got an event-driven architecture, then that's not what you use an orchestration tool for. And this is another thing I found, right? It's like a lot of AI use cases in production, you have basically an event-driven system, right? It's like if you're having a conversation with a chatbot, you're sending messages, you're sending events, you're getting a response back. That, I would argue, should be dealt with by microservices. But something interesting that we do, because we have integrations to these underlying pieces of cloud infrastructure, is monitor them. So if you had your LLM hosted on a box somewhere, then we would be able to monitor that. And something else which is quite unique about Orchestra is that we put data products first. So what does that mean? It means that you can define data products. It's just a thing. It's just a business object. But then you can attach things like pipelines to it. So then if those pipelines have metrics associated with them, like costs, like particular data assets, they're then nested in the hierarchy of that product. So you can say, okay, this is the cost of the data pipeline to serve my product. Something else you can do by monitoring the box that's hosting your LLM is also work out the usage of it. So then Orchestra is sort of doing some orchestration in this case, but the main value is giving you an update on the health of your product. Maybe your LLM is hosted on the EC2 box, but then it's going really well and you're hitting capacity. How do you know what the status is of that product? Right? How do you know the cost of that EC2 box? How do you know how many requests are going through it? This is all information which is helpful from the product angle that we can also access. And that it sort of goes back to how we built a platform, which is to be able to monitor and gather data in addition to sort of triggering and monitoring workflows.
Yeah, and especially the monitoring of workflows is something I tend to actually back up all the models I'm using, so embedding models, but also the LLMs, because often the downtimes you have at the moment with OpenAI, but also on Azure, they are really crazy.
But also not just downtimes, but like delays, right? And also, I guess you can also have an example where the token length is too high.
Yes, and I think for me, data and AI is often, it's a game of earned knowledge. So you often have stuff you only really know once you experience the same problem a few times. What are the little tricks and hacks you picked up in data orchestration that you now apply to all your problems?
I think the right level of abstraction is always good. I think Prefect do this really well. Their big sell was, just put a decorator on a function and it becomes a task. That's a great idea. just make tasks modular and have them do all the boilerplate stuff like error logging, monitoring of data, all of that stuff. That's really important. I think another thing, just more broadly in data, is just always to ask like why you're doing something and sort of work out the actual requirements and like have a conversation with somebody about what they are. Because, there's just so many times in data where we want to implement an architecture, but when you sort of peel back the onion and work out why you're trying to do what you're doing, you could probably do something a bit better. They're probably the two things that spring to mind.
Nice. And what would you say is actually missing from the data orchestration space? So what would you love to see built?
I would love to see a world where you don't need any orchestration at all. So where everything is basically stream-based and cheap. And, if you're a Kafka person, you'd argue that is just Kafka and Confluent. But if you're an analytics person, you know that like you need more than just streams. You need easy ways to monitor the whole system, like nice dev workflows, and obviously like asset orientated programming, an ability to sort of think about what you're building in terms of sort of like the end products rather than like tasks. The end products being things like machine learning models, dashboards, data tables, and so on. But yeah, I think being able to have everything, but like it's streaming and it's cheap would be cool. Basically, build a product so that I don't need to exist.
So what's next? What's next for you? What's next for Orchestra? What's in the pipeline? What you can already tease a little bit?
We've got quite a lot of big things coming up. Something we've already got in the works is our monitoring dashboard. So you get a lot in sort of observability tool. Wouldn't it be cool if you just had this without having to have another tool? Wouldn't it be good if the Airflow UI had all of that? If you answered yes to any of those questions, there are some things we're putting in Orchestra. From the technical side, I guess there are two things I would highlight. So the first, obviously, is sort of like, well, maybe three. The first is like Git control. So I think surfacing that will be that'll unlock a lot of stuff for us. The second thing is like accounts and role-based access control. So the ability for you to actually deploy Orchestra across multiple teams but still retain end-to-end lineage. This is in beta, but it's not out yet. And then, you might also think that an orchestration tool should be able to run things like Python. I mean, would you agree with that? Yeah, so we might do that soon. But only specific workloads, only serverless ones.
And if people are inspired and now want to jump into Orchestra, where would you actually point them? So what are the best places to go into and directly jump into?
Easy one to finish on, thanks. So we have free tier. You can build quite a lot in it for free, and that's just at getorchestra.io. Click on one of the big buttons, and there's a lot of information on the site. You can find me on LinkedIn. I've got a blog as well that has quite a lot of content, and we have docs. So I guess we'll add some links to this post.